I thought I'd reflect on some of the comments I've heard this morning. First of all, Stephen says, we are not talking about biodiversity, we're not talking about policy. Thank goodness it's not on the title. For the next hour, yes you are. I heard Andy Simpson talk about enormous coalitions are needed to address the challenges that we have right now. On a table down there, when we were desperate to have a little chat about some of the things that were being talked about up here on stage, we were starting to talk about the quality versus quantity discussion. We're having that, is it best to get in there and do a few things very, very well, or is it about big issues, trying to change society and so on? I've also heard about hostiles in society, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But the thing that really got my goat was Julian when he called me a communicate veteran, which probably means that every year now, from here on in, round about this time of the year, you're going to dust me down and drive me to Brighton. I think that's terrible. Why am I here today, as opposed to, I think, 8 communicates I've done? Well, it's also a 10th anniversary of me being involved with Defra and their various strategies on biodiversity. And in 2002, 10 years ago, there was what was it called? It was, thank you, Sarah. Working with a grain of nature, the England Biodiversity Strategy was launched. And on the back of that, there was a thing called the Education and Public Understanding Group, which was set up as a result of that. Here we are, 10 years on, with a new strategy, which is Biodiversity 2020. This was launched last year by the then Secretary of State, Caroline Spellman, at a lovely event at Camley Street up in London, where she extolled the virtues of wildlife gardening to the assembled company, who were veterans like me. It was lovely to see a Secretary of State really getting turned on to wildlife. And in the reshuffle that we've had recently, I can guarantee that we still have a champion for biodiversity in there, and that is Richard Benyon. Some of my roles, as some of you know, I'm on the board of Natural England. We have a very good relationship with some of our ministers, Richard in particular, and he is looking for real changes to happen between now and 2020. Whether that can be done is another matter. The aspirations in Biodiversity 2020 are enormous. And for the People Engagement Group, which has been set up as part of the delivery mechanisms, or the think tank to delivery mechanisms in Biodiversity 20, we are charged with a very simple outcome. And that is, by 2020, significantly more people will be engaged in biodiversity issues, aware of its value, and taking positive action. We have 8 years to change the world. So the PEG, the People Engagement Group, we wanted to set up something quite different from the old Education and Public Understanding Group that was there before, although some of the faces are the same. And I'm going to introduce 2 of those people here. I'm going to ask them some questions in a minute around our discussions we're having at PEG. On my right, Director of Public Engagement and Learning at Kew, very well branded today, Angela McFarlane. Andy Simpson, you would have, if you had been in here for one of the sessions earlier today, Andy Simpson, ex-head of learning at RSPB and now leading on their Natural Childhood Initiative. And right on my far side, right, is Simon Christmas, who is actually working as a researcher for Defra on a study which is going to help frame our work. And we'll come on to that in a little while. So the PEG, we brought together all sorts of individuals with interests in this area. So we have the likes of Chris Baines, Ed Gillespie, sort of independent thinkers in this world. We also have people that are representing organisations. But I've had this long worry that when you put all these people together in a room, 20, 25 people, and we all pontificate, that actually do you take things forward enough? And one of the things that we decided to do quite early on with Savita, who you all know and love, was to say, well, can we have a much bigger community that is linked to the People Engagement Group? And welcome to the People Engagement Group. The Communicate community, these 1,000 people, these hundreds of organisations that have been engaged in over the last 10 years, we see you as vitally important in achieving the tasks that we've been set. Over the last 30 years, and I've been involved in this world for 30, 35 years, I've seen enormous change. We have come so far. This is a recurring theme through today. The opportunities for children, for the public, for communities to get engaged in biodiversity are legion. Nothing like this was envisaged 30, 35 years ago. So we should all pat ourselves on the back. We have come an enormously long way. But if we're going to achieve these targets, well, actually government don't have targets anymore, but this outcome by 2020, we've got to change our game. We've got to up our game substantially. I'm sort of minded, I think, of I'm a father, I'm a grandfather, and now I'm getting the second generation of kids in the back of the seat saying, well, on these long car journeys, are we there yet? And you know what you always say, yes, we're almost there, not long now. And I feel we're a bit like that. We've got to up our game and actually say, yes, we can get there, and we've got 8 years to get there. We need to better apply, I think, social marketing, psychology, learning to achieve our outcomes. And maybe we've got to stop apologising for being middle class. Maybe there's an enormous marketing and engagement opportunity out there right on our doorstep if we were just to grab hold of it. As we develop Biodiversity 2020 and our response to it through PEG, what we're doing in this first year is to actually try and answer a few very fundamental questions. We're here to add value to what all you guys and loads of other people that are not here today out there, we're here to add value to all the work that's going on. So that means we shouldn't duplicate. So there is a question, which is, are there audiences out there where we can get a really big bang for our buck if we were to come together in a coalition to address them? But what are we addressing them with? What is the question? What do we want them to do? What do we want them to think? I'm going to ask you to engage us in that debate in a little while. Also, as we've been having this think tank, there's a question that hasn't been asked yet. We've thought about the who and the what. We're having a long debate about that. But are there questions that the PEG and you and us as a sector needs to be asked? Simon said before lunch that we really need to up our game. We need to go into that big creative leap he talked about. And I wonder, is that big creative leap sitting here in this room waiting to be born? These guys have been involved with me over the last year or so, and there are others in the audience here who have been involved with me. One of the things that I'm really interested in, and I'm almost obsessive about, is this idea of hard-to-reach audiences. And I wonder, Angela, have you got a view on our discussions on hard-to-reach audiences?
I should say this is a personal view now, not a corporate one. All my working life I've been involved in education in some form, and I believe fervently in equality of opportunity. But I think it's naive to expect equality of outcome as a result. So I think it's really important that organisations like the one I work for make what we do as accessible as possible, not least because we're paid for by the taxpayer. But I don't think we should expect every single member of society to respond to us in the same way. And I think we have to focus on critical mass. And in something as important as conserving biodiversity, you have to start by fishing where the fish are. And you have to start as we will be doing with our Grow Wild project, for example, we know that in order to get the kinds of numbers that we need, we will have to work with a lot of organisations who work with nice middle-class young people who will be only too receptive to this. But that doesn't mean to say we won't also be working very hard with the organisations who work with young people who don't have that cultural advantage to make sure that they also have an opportunity. But inevitably, the outcome will not be even. We will get more return on the investment in the first group. That doesn't make the investment in the second group any less valuable. We just have to be more realistic about what's going to happen. But we could have made the decision to concentrate all of our resource on hard-to-reach audiences. But the overall outcome, in terms of raised awareness and actual action, would have been far less. And so I think it's important, particularly if you're fortunate enough as we are to have won this amazing grant from the big lottery, it's important that we are as inclusive as we can possibly be, but that we're realistic in where we're going to get the outcome.
Mm. Interesting. I was at, for those of you who don't know, I'm also a Heritage Lottery Fund trustee, and I was at an assessment at a project yesterday where we were talking about the hard-to-reach audiences, whereas, in fact, the project actually wants to go to the easy-to-reach audiences. And it was HLF that was driving them down this hard-to-reach. So there's a lot of issues around this. But it's really about, I keep coming back to this biggest bang for our buck. What can we do in this very short period to achieve the outcomes as we've been set by government? Which brings me on to Andy, really, because Andy and I have worked together for a long time. I'm the one that goes up here, does the airy-fairy stuff, and Andy always grounds me. So in terms of ambition for the 2020, Andy, have you got any thoughts on, and certainly reflections on our conversations in PEG so far?
Yeah, surprisingly. If one were a cynic, which of course I'm not, you look sometimes at bodies set up by government involving NGOs, and you come to the conclusion that you get invited every quarter, given a nice lunch, have a nice chat, and are kicked into the long grass. And it's a diffusing mechanism. Or even worse, that actually government are looking to piggyback your own activities and your own achievements and using that to their own ends. I don't believe that with PEG. I truly do believe that Defra wants to succeed in this. And there are champions inside of Defra. However, up to now, what we have failed to do is develop the momentum of a movement. And what I'm talking about is that kind of lovely virtuous circle whereby the Defra mechanism is used to fuel and to celebrate success, which then empowers Defra to be more ambitious. Targets and its engagement, and the whole profile of the area goes upwards. There have been little snippets of that. I mean, historically, sadly, a lot of people went to the previous incarnations with a very single organisational view. And often that single organisational view was around funding. In other words, if we go to this, we might get some government money to do something. Sadly, that didn't very often happen, and it may well not happen now. But I think about ambition, what we need to be thinking about and what we need to be recognising is that in order for us to get anywhere with this agenda, it's not about what Defra does or Q or RSPB or any of the other organisations here. It's about what we do. And the challenge for us all is a principled one to say, well, how much are we allowed to step back from our single organisational agenda, which is obviously important because that's what pays the bills, in favour of something which is bigger? Because only that bigger one is going to take us from where we want to be. So the future of the PEG group will be about, for me, the development of that culture whereby it's not what I can get out of it, it's what I can put into it.
Thanks, Andy. I think that PEG group issue, I think, is one we need to bottom out at this conference as well. this idea of the communicate community becoming the PEG community, because if we are going to make that difference in the next few years, and if we are at that on the edge of becoming mainstream, how the hell do we do it? How do we organise ourselves in order to take that forward? Andy mentioned resource. It was quite clear government has got none. So this is big society in action. I had a really lovely evening a couple of weeks ago up at Cheltenham. There was the Cheltenham Literature Festival. Marcus Brigstock doing his new show, which is called The Briggs Society. It's a hoot. And it sort of puts a mirror up against the whole idea of a big society, which has now become quite an issue of derision. But in fact, what I'm talking about here is about a big society solution. It's about us coming together to try and solve not a single problem, not a simple problem, a very complex problem, but we've got a resource base in which we can do it. These organisations and you. But Defra has put some money where its mouth is. And one of the early conversations we had was around segmentation and looking for the links between segmentation behaviours and trying to come up with some solution to that question. Where should we put our resource? Who and what? Simon, over there, has got the wonderful job of leading on this segmentation scoping study. Simon, do you want to tell us a little bit about it and if there are any questions, any challenges for the audience?
Absolutely, and on the subject of piggybacking, thank you for letting me piggyback on this session. So I think, building on this phrase you picked up, Doug, about taking a great creative leap, I think the job of researchers like me is to help people look before they leap. The particular project that we have at the moment is all about taking the first steps towards, I'm actually going to read this one sentence because it's the one I've got to actually deliver against, towards a better understanding of the attitudes, values, motivations and behaviours of key groups in relation to biodiversity and the opportunities for and barriers to action. We're going to be reporting in 6 months. I would love to say that by that point I will be coming back to you with all the answers. You know that's not true. You know that's not possible. It's also not quite the brief, which is a really important part because it leads on to the contribution I'm going to ask for from you. This is a scoping study. We're not actually undertaking anything like a segmentation. So what we're going to be doing in the next few months is surveying some of the existing evidence. There's a lot of stuff actually all out there already. What do we already know about audiences and about how best to think about dividing them up? We're going to be doing a small amount of new qualitative work, but primarily we're going to be making recommendations for further research. I'm just going to pick up on this word segmentation very briefly. If you've looked in the biogs as well, you'll see that this is called the Biodiversity Segmentation Scoping Study, which is a wonderful mouthful. Segmentation is one of those semi-technical words. Some of you will have no idea what it is, and that's completely fine. Some of you will have very specific ideas about what a segmentation is. It can be used in narrower, broader senses. So let me just put this very crudely, because I have a very open mind about this. The issue is, as I see it, is that there are lots of different potential audiences out there. There are lots of different potential ways of carving up the world in order to think about it. They overlap. It's very complicated. And we need some way of getting a handle on this diversity, because we know that one size does not fit all. It's a point that's been made a number of times this morning. Go back to that first presentation where Wendy was talking about the need to tailor to some extent what we do. That's the problem that we're going to be looking at in this scoping study. Exactly how we go about solving it is a challenge ahead. So how can you contribute? The thing that working as a researcher, the thing that I fear most in life is when you present findings and people say, oh, that's interesting, because normally that means I don't know how to use it. And research has to be useful. We talk about changing behaviour. The first difference I've got to make is I've got to enable you to do something different, both through this piece of work and through the work that follows. So please, I'm really interested to hear what would be useful to you. What could research enable you to do that you can't do currently in this area? Opinions are very welcome. Opinions that are backed up with rationale and evidence are even more welcome. That's very helpful for me. But opinions are fine too. So please feel free to collar me. I'll be here the rest of today and tomorrow and have a go at me about that, because I'd love to hear.
So, the proposition is quite simple. Time's running out. We know what's causing loss in terms of biodiversity, and we also know what's causing adverse environmental change. The challenge is immense, but the issues are not high on others' agenda. Even though I'm standing here nominally linked straight up to a Secretary of State through the PEG group, we know that Defra is quite a minor department. Sorry, Sarah, to say this, but it is within government. There are other government departments that hold much more sway. There are other bodies in government that hold much more sway. In other words, and the government that we have is a reflection of us. Not necessarily us in this room, but us as a society. So our society hasn't got it right. We've got limited resources as a sector, as a movement, or wherever we are. And is it better to concentrate this resource on a few groups of people, or should we broadcast to as many folk as possible? If we focus, which groups are the most important, and what do we want them to do? There's your question. This is not an easy session. These questions are not easy ones to answer, but I bet in your darkest moments you ask them of yourself. This isn't a research-based exercise. This is an opinion-based exercise, and I'd like you each on your tables to discuss that last question. If a focused approach is adopted, which groups are the most important, and what do we want them to do?